morning, everybody. Now it's high time for us to start the roundtable on the theme of new global opportunities, new leadership, and renewed responsibility, and new policy. I hope this kind of topic will epitomize the current world situation, where many of the leading countries have newly starting leadership in the wake of 30 more countries' election in the year of 2012. Now, I really appreciate Professor Wu Xinbo's, the convening powers, for us to have such kind of excellent, world-renowned presenters. From China, President Yang Jiemin, and Japan, Hitoshi Tanaka-san, and from USA, Jonathan Pollock, and Korea, Dr. Kim Yong-ho, and Russia from Director General Andrei Gorduno. I think he will come soon in time. Maybe if I provide some brief presentation as a food for thought for more interactive discussion during this session. The international, especially the new leaderships are facing with new challenges in global arena, and also in regional area, and also their domestic imperatives. In case of the global issues, the international community are plagued with some unprecedented inundation of global crisis, which started in 2008, which from food and energy and water and financial crisis, and subsequent development crisis. And in case of financial crisis, has developed into even integration crisis in Europe. But problem is still we find ourselves in the dark tunnels with the inadequacy of global regime threatening the international community. Especially the Eurozone case, as I told you, now is threatening even the integrational achievement. And in case of Iranian and North Korean cases, also threatening the validity of NPT itself. And in those northeastern region, we are concerned with some possible domino effect. And also in case of the Arab Spring, we are struggling with ambiguity of the future of the Arab Spring. And even the situation in Syria and Libya are testing the norms proposed by the UN, such as R2P and universal jurisdiction. And now we are, everybody is wondering if there might be another outside intervention in Syrian case. And now Doha round is as good as dead. So so on top of these kind of things, the climate change is aggravate the situation. Even though there's annual conference struggling to find out some legally binding document, but as of now, what they achieved is they just agreed to agree in the future. So, there's serious lack of global governance in that issues. On top of that, adaptation is really a real threat to the developing countries. So, if I give some general wrapping up, on the arena of global issues, the professional pessimism is overshadowing the cautious optimism. That is what I observed as of now. On the regional issues, the U.S. rebalancing pivot to Asia is could be some another topic for us to talk on that issues, which such U.S. Rebalancing has some impact on most of the major corner of the current contemporary situation. And provocation of North Korea has a great impact. First, it challenged to, we have to think about the validity of the UN Security Council. And also, we have to check whether validity of the six-party talk. And some territorial dispute might be another concern, whether it might be developed to the tech wagging the dog phenomenon. So I think the only silver lining in East Asian region is there has been some achievement in regional financial coordination, exemplified by Shanghai initiative, which might have some very slight clue for the further regional integration in the future. So I should make a full stop here. And on top of that, our excellent world-class, world-renowned presenters will give some, will deliver their insightful intuition and observation on where we are and where we should go. So, on the organizational matters, I'll give you 10 minutes for each presenters, to be followed by 5 minutes discussant, acute, comment or question, and to be followed by 3 minutes, the response by every presenters. And I think we might have some time for the QA sessions, because today we have some really we have a really rare chance to enjoy question and answer session by excellent, distinguished audience. So now I'd like to give the floors President Yang Jiemian, President of Shanghai Institute of International Studies.
I would like to talk about the continuities, changes of concepts, and the diplomatic priorities and the practices, opportunities and the challenges down the road. In China, we have the one generation down to the another. So continuities are the main features of China's foreign policy. These include, among other things, independent and peaceful foreign policy, role of peaceful development, win-win cooperation, 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, multipolarity, and moving toward a fairer and a more justified international system. However, today I would like to concentrate on the changes. And conceptual changes are very important for the new leadership to guide the coming decade of China's foreign relations with other countries. And I'm very pleased to see Bob Zorik is here. He was talking about a stakeholder which created a lot of academic jobs in China and in the world to discuss about. And now President Xi Jinping also has made some conceptual innovations. First of all, I think the new leadership is more on the global power standing to present our views, what kind of the world it should be, it could be, and it should not be, and it could not be. In the past, China was deemed as a regional power with global implications, but the Americans said us that China was a regional power with global aspirations, whatever we will talk about. But after 2008, China was prematurely and unwillingly be put into the limelight of the world arena, and now we have to think accordingly. And we are creating and try to think the so-called concept buildings. For instance, now the 18th Party Congress called for holding high the banner of peace, development, cooperation. That's Hu Jintao's. Now we put win-win. This win-win not on the economic, trade, investment, but at the higher level, that's overall level, that China wants to have a win-win cooperation with different systems, different kinds of countries. And also we are redefining what strategic opportunities are. And this time, Mr. Xi emphasized more on the challenges side of the strategic opportunity. And Xi Jinping made a very important talk last year on July the 7th at the Tsinghua University, but most of the media ignored it, did not pay enough attention. That is, Mr. Xi Jinping made a much more clearer standing on defending China's core national interests. However, diplomatic relations and foreign relations, not only the matters related to concepts, ideas, but more on the concrete matters. How do you deal with these? So the priorities and the practices are more important. The new leadership is attaching more strategic importance to neighboring countries. And I was told that throughout this year, there will be mutual visits from China and to China. The top Chinese leaderships will visit and meet people from almost every and each our neighboring country. And the new leadership is advocating for new type of major power relations. It's a little bit complicated because the Chinese said that this new type of major power relations, then what is the old or traditional ones, and what are the main contents in it? But our American friends said they would like to have a new model of rising and established powers. So when you read this catchphrase, you know what it means. So that's the cultural difference between the Chinese catchphrase and the American catchphrase. And the Chinese new leadership is showing readiness to tackle with hotspot issues. Everybody here noticed that in recent weeks or months, China is adopting a very much proactive policy on easing the tensions on the Korean Peninsula and others. And the new leadership is having both firmness and flexibilities in defending sovereignty and territorial integrity. On the one hand, China made it clear our standings on South China Sea disputes. On the other, China, with a population of 1.3 plus billion people, had recently just decided to launch a strategic partnership with a country with only, let's say, 200 or 300,000 people, Brunei. So this also shows that China's flexibilities of seeking for cooperation, common development in the disputed area in the South China Sea region. And now what are the opportunities and the challenges? Opportunities are plenty. First of all, China will adhere to the role of peaceful development, which guarantees China on the continued rising curve economically, politically, and culturally. And furthermore, the world will keep on the right track, I think, thus providing China with favorable environments. In the past almost 70 years, the world avoided having the massive and war like World War I, World War II. So this gives us some confidence that we could avoid such global wide wars, conflicts, if the Soviet Union and the United States avoided head-on conflicts because of the terrible nuclear disasters. But now we are on the more positive side. That is the increasingly closed the interdependence, not only in economic affairs, but also in the people-to-people culture, academic, like this. The networking between China and the United States are the most, one of the most in the world now, with its enhancing comprehensive national strength, including matured policy. China enjoys many advantages in dealing with international community. The Chinese leadership, the new leadership, has become even more self-confident. We say we are confident in the road we are taking, and in the theories we are under this guidance and the systems that we adhere to and apply to other fields. And the challenges, of course, China will meet more challenges in the second decade of the 21st century than the first one. Firstly, China needs to consolidate domestic bases under increasingly complicated and pluralistic situation. Consensus building and synchronized domestic foreign policies are not easy jobs for the new leadership. The second is China faces a decade of maritime disputes, but there is no sign of effective solution. Therefore, China must try to prevent and manage the possible crises. Thirdly, China must show to the world the success of its policies concerning major power relations. China needs to develop its relations with the United States, fresh out its relations with Russia, and advance our relations with other BRICS states, streamline our relations with the Europeans, and normalize our relations with Japan, etc. And finally, China needs to be more inclusive and compatible with the entire international community. Material, physical interests, that's important, but we should not be confined by these, especially when China has become relatively better off, and we are looking for all-round developments of our relations of the international community. Therefore, China faces a hard job of reforming international system, conceptual convergence, and squaring off norms and rules. Ladies and gentlemen, China is on the rise, and China's rising path curve will be long and full of twists and turns, and I never believed that China could overtake the United States within 10 or 20 years' time. It's a long, long way to go, but I'm quite sure with the cooperation and the mutual support that with the United States, with other major powers, with our neighboring countries, and other members of the international community, China will emerge finally a real peace-loving, strong, prosperous country. I think on this, I would like to conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you, President Yang. If I just give some one immediate comment, maybe I'd like to pay attention to words, conceptual innovation. So maybe what kind of conceptual innovation could be incarnated, in detailed aspect. Especially, I think now it's high time for China to demonstrate some striking leadership in dealing with the North Korean nuclear issues. Without solving the North Korean nuclear issues, maybe I suspect how China could sustain the status as a leadership in this region. And also, I wonder if new Xi Jinping leadership will uphold the economy first policy, which has been advocated by former President Hu. So maybe then we could expect some other questions and debate afterwards. And now I'd like to invite Director General Andrei Gorduno, who is from Russia, from Russian International Affairs Council. Mr. Gorduno. Let's welcome.
I think that the topic of this forum is very timely and very important. And let me try to get to the issue that was mentioned by our chairman, the issue of conceptual innovation. In a way, all countries of the world, and definitely all the countries of the Asian Pacific region, are confronted with this challenge of conceptual innovation. How to reinvent the foreign policy, how to make it more efficient without deviating from the integrity of our foreign policy strategies. And Russia is definitely not an exception. If you look at the situation in my country, you'll see that there is a strive for innovation. Over the last 10 years, Russia got back to the international relations as a great power. And with all the success stories notwithstanding, I would venture to say that the revival of the Russian presence was caused and was founded primarily on 3 pillars. First of all, Russia is a nuclear superpower. It is the only country in the world that can compete with the United States in terms of strategic nuclear arms. Therefore, the US-Russian strategic relationship is still the cornerstone of the global security system. Second, Russia is a member of important international institutions. Above all, Russia is a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, together with China, together with the United States, with UK and France. And of course, this position gives Russia a certain leverage in international relations. And finally, Russia is arguably the main remaining depository of natural resources in the world. One can say that in terms of the accumulated deposits of hydrocarbons and water and land mass and timber and some other materials, Russia is probably more important than any other country on the planet. So these are the three pillars on which the Russian foreign policy was based. The question that I ask myself, are these pillars enough to guarantee influence and active engagement in international relations of the 21st century? And my answer is no. I would venture to say that if the Russian foreign policy continues to be based on just three pillars I mentioned, it will become archaic and antiquated. The world is changing, the currency of power is changing, the rules of engagement are changing, and every country has to think about additional assets that it can utilize in pursuing its foreign policy. The sheer might, be it the military might or even the economic might, if I might say so, is not enough. All of us are looking for what I would define as smart foreign policy. And smart foreign policy means that you should activate non-material assets of your foreign policy, or assets that used to be marginal. The power of international education and science is becoming important. Where your kids are going to get their education might define their outlook, their mentality, not just their career tracks, but their integrity to a certain extent. The power of migrations is becoming one of the most important driving forces in the current international system. If you look at soft power like culture, cultural attractions might be more important than military balances. So I think that Russia really has a challenge, how to upgrade, how to modernize, how to diversify its foreign policy. And this is definitely related to all geographical dimensions of the Russian foreign policy. It's a Eurasian country, therefore it has to operate on different dimensions of the global situation. It has to work with the European Union, and we do have some stumbling blocks in our relations with the Union, partially because the Union itself is not in the best shape right now, but partially because Russia has to invest more in working with Europe, with its Western neighbors. We do have major security problems to the south of the Russian borders. And definitely the most explicit problem is the situation in Afghanistan. What will happen in this country after the international coalition withdraws? And that is going to happen next year. How it might affect the security situation in Central Asia. Will it have a spillover effect on Russia? These are not easy issues, and Russia cannot resolve these problems without very active cooperation with its partners. These partners can be found in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. These partners can be found in the greater Middle East. These partners can be found in the West. But definitely it will be a bumpy road. And definitely Russia will have to be very creative and very inventive. Now, if we turn to the Asia-Pacific region, I would say that the challenges for the Russian foreign policy are also quite immense. We are proud to enjoy very positive and stable relations with China. China remains Russia's strategic partner in the region. Our trade is likely to get almost to $100 billion this year, and it continues to grow. However, structurally, Russia's relations with China are not something that we can be proud of. We export to China primarily energy and raw materials. This cooperation is limited mostly to large and super large state or semi-state companies. We do not have the level of penetration that would turn this relationship into an important social factor. We need to diversify our relations with China, and we need to make sure that this slogan, Partnership for the Modernization, becomes more than just a slogan. This is not easy because it requires a considerable homework to be done. Russia has, above all, to modernize its Far East and its Siberian regions, and that requires a lot of political will. Whether the Russian leadership has this will is yet to be seen. There are attempts made to revitalize the eastern part of the country, but definitely there is much more to be done. If we put aside the relations with China, Russia has to handle some issues that are remaining residual issues of the Cold War in the Asian Pacific region. We still have territorial dispute with Japan, which is definitely a residual from the previous era, and it looks very archaic right now, but still it's an impediment on the way of better relations with Japan. Russia cannot isolate itself from the situation on the Korean Peninsula. And again, we see a stumbling block there. Many would argue that it is impossible to re-energize the six-party talks. But if so, then we should find alternative ways to handle the situation there. And a lot will depend on the ability of major countries of the region to work together. Last year, Russia chaired the APEC summit in Vladivostok, and that was a major event for the Russian Federation. However, it is important that Russia can capitalize on its chairmanship. And unfortunately, Russia's engagement in the economic relations in the region are still quite limited. Definitely, we can do much more than we are doing right now. It is tempting to argue that the situation is too volatile. There are too many independent variables. There are too many external factors that prevent us from defining our priorities. However, I would say that it is important that our foreign policies are not opportunistic, but rather strategic. We need to think out of the box about not just immediate consequences of our actions, but about long-term implications of what we are doing. Definitely, the international situation is volatile, and we cannot predict what will happen in the world in a year, in 5 years, and 10 years from now. But if we do not shape our futures, if we tend to be opportunistic, who will shape our futures for us? I tend to be moderately optimistic about the Russian foreign policy. I have that we have all the ingredients of a successful foreign policy line. Russia can and should be a responsible player in the region. However, a lot depends on the political will, on the consistency of the Russian policy, and on its ability to find a proper balance with its major neighboring countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gortunov's very comprehensive and succinct description on where new Russian policies are. I fully agree with your expression of the moderate optimism on the future of the Russia. If I raise just one observation as ambassador to the United Nations during the last 5 years, I got some a little different nuance from Russian policies. In case of the U.S., the coordination. If my memory is correct, in 2009, there were some, which is called reset with the United States, including Northern Distribution Network cases cooperation with the United States. But at the same time, in Security Council, the numbers of the veto by Russia has increased, sharply increased from 2 to 8 during the last 5 years. So, and then in the case of the Pacific Asian region, it's very peaceful and very cooperative. But in the Western area, I mean, where the Russian regional hegemon is prevailing, still there are some tension, tense, development. So maybe I wonder how we could describe such kind of two-sided approaches. Thank you. And my next speakers will be Professor Hitoshi Tanaka, who is working as a director of the Institute for International Strategy at Japan Research Institute. He's also a Korea, diplomat, the equivalent of Korea foreign minister in other Asian countries.
Thanks very much. I am the only person who appears without tie. I asked Jonathan Porak to switch tie, but he refused. He sort of refused a tie with Japan. So I'm a bit ashamed of myself without tie. Let me talk about Mr. Abe's foreign policy, possible foreign policy after the upper house election coming summer. Most observers speculate that LDP under Mr. Abe will win at the coming summer upper house election, and he may possibly seize the majority of the seats in the upper house, which does mean that LDP will have majority. Both have this, theoretically meaning that Prime Minister Abe will have a free hand in pursuit of his own goals, even in foreign policy. But let me try to be very objective, because I left the government 8 years ago as a deputy foreign minister, and for the past 8 years I have been observing Japanese foreign policies, exchanging views with the public intellectuals in many countries. So I am accustomed to analyze the Japanese foreign policy in a much more objective way. I will be talking about, I think, 5 areas, policy areas: economic policy, the possible constitutional revision, the question of the past, history, and the national security policy, and Japan's policy to East Asia. Those 5 terribly important policy area for Japan. First, the question of economic policy. After the upper house election, Prime Minister Abe will have a very serious time in pursuit of his what we call Abenomics, because Abenomics is said to have 3 arrows: the very aggressive financial policy, flexible public investment policy, and the third, growth policy, growth strategy, which is yet to be elaborated. And this growth policy must involve a thorough deregulation, and also the sort of new policies in the inefficient industrial sector, agricultural sector as well. And all this, the growth strategy must coincide with Japan's participation in the negotiation of TPP. So for the remaining period of this year, Japan will have to tackle with a vested interest domestically. If you are to talk about liberalization in the agricultural market, you would have to fight against the vested interest vested interest which has been favoring LDP as the sort of the in various elections and sort of there has been strong political lobbies. Agriculture has got a strong political bodies, but yet LDP, I mean, Japan will not have election for the coming 3 years after the upper house election. So there is a possibility, there is a real possibility that Japan may be able to get rid of all the vested interest and go a very deep deregulation and also reforms in the agricultural sector as well. And this is probably one of the best opportunity for Japan to be able to make a very strong contribution to the international trade as well. So let us wait and see what policies Mr. Abe will pursue in the field of the growth strategy and also TPP. And also I would very much like to see the economic integration in East Asia as well. We are talking about trilateral free trade agreement between Japan, China, and Korea, along with RCEP, the much more wider regional free trade agreement as well. So those three agreements may lead to the liberalization of the Japanese market as well. Point number one. Point number two, the question of constitutional revision. There has been lots of talk about the possible revision of the Constitution of Japan. And indeed, Mr. Abe, the grandson of Mr. Kishi, also a very conservative politician, nationalistic politician as well. This may be, constitutional revision must be his ultimate goal. But yet, probably, it will take longer years for Japan to come to the sort of real revision of the Constitution. The Prime Minister Abe talks about the revision in relation to the procedural clauses, the Article 96. But there has been strong disagreement in relation to that, because why don't we start debating about procedures before sort of debating the real substance of the constitutional revision? So my guess is that it will take more than 3 years for Japan to address the substance of possible revisions of the Japanese constitution. So probably after the next general election, which is supposed to be taking place in 3 years, there may be the case for real constitutional revision. Now, let me talk about the third issue, question of history. I have been campaigning in Japan that the question of the history may not be only to do with the question of the pre-Second World War. The question of history is also to do with the history after the Second World War, and in particular, after the issuance of Murayama Statement in 1995. There has been sort of controversies regarding Murayama Statement and also Kono Statement, which is to do with what we call comfort women. There has been strong criticism against the possible revision of those statements from the neighboring nations, not just neighboring nations, but from the United States as well. I say that we need to face up with the history, not just the history before the war, but even after the war, even after the issuance of Murayama Statement. We cannot deny the fact that all the cabinets, after Prime Minister Murayama, who is a socialist, but the LDP prime ministers have endorsed Murayama Statement as well. So there is no other way but to make a full-fledged endorsement of Murayama and Kono Statement. I think Prime Minister Abe is a very nationalistic and conservative politician, but yet he is a very strong pragmatist. So I would hope that he will not touch upon the question of reinterpretation of the history. The fourth element is to do with the question of national security policy in Japan. There is a strong likelihood that Abe administration will come up with various legislations regarding, for instance, the establishment of Japanese version of NSC, National Security Council, because we do need a sort of strategic unit in the cabinet to deal with the question of broad strategies. I think foreign ministry needs to be sort of participating in much broader interagency sort of set for creating the Japanese strategic policies. So most probably the new Abe administration after the upper house election will produce various legislative initiatives regarding the establishment of NSC, but also in relation to the question of collective self-defense. It may be needed for Japan to talk in serious way to enable the self-defense force to participate in, for instance, peacekeeping operation in a full-fledged way. It doesn't make sense for Japan to send troops, but without shooting, even when there were sort of attack to the fellow blue helmets. Doesn't make sense. But the current constitutional interpretation is that due to the Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, those activities on part of the self-defense force in the peacekeeping operation is forbidden as well. Doesn't make sense. So I would hope that the constitutional reinterpretation will take place in relation to the UN activities. But in relation to the activities with the United States, I think we need to wait for the constitutional revision. In case we change the constitution so that we exercise collective self-defense with the United States, we would probably need to revise the US-Japan Security Treaty as well, because Japan does not have any obligation to defend United States under the current existing treaty. In case we are able to exercise our collective self-defense duty, there is a need to change the US-Japan Security Treaty in a much more reciprocal way. Let me complete my statement by talking about Japan's East Asia policy. Prime Minister Abe, probably Chinese colleagues interpret Abe's policy. People call it value policy, meaning that Japan wishes to strengthen the partnerships with various nations who uphold democracy, like Korea, like India, like Indonesia, like Australia. It's called value diplomacy. I do not like it at all because value is important, but yet there are a bunch of different values as well. So democracy is one thing, clearly, but yet the policies toward better governance probably must involve democratic principles, but that direction I think we need to support. So there's no reason why we should put China in isolation. And there is no way for us to put China in isolation because we are so interdependent. Therefore, I would very much hope that Japan will come up with much comprehensive East Asia policy. I talk a lot about the triangular relationship between Japan, United States, and China. If you look back for the past 150 years, the fate of East Asia has been decided by the triangular relationship between China, United States, and Japan. First, Commodore Perry came to Japan because the United States wanted to trade with China. The United States wanted to use Japan as a supply port. The second occasion, Japan was quite aggressive. Japan became modernized and went into China. The United States wanted to stop it. So it's all this triangular relationship. This time, China has risen, and China will rise in enormous way. Japan is in decline, but yet Japan has the right opportunity to create a win-win situation in East Asia. Because Japan still has a formidable economic, technological capacity. Therefore, I think what is important for us all, and particularly for the Abe administration, which will most probably last for the coming 3 years, it is extremely important for us to come up with the right East Asia policy, which is to do with the triangular relationship between Japan, United States, and China. I finish here. Thanks very much.
I think that it's very interesting comment that new Abe administration will come up with some various registration, including some NSC similar system. My immediate question on top of my head is what kind of various new registration might be possible before the revision of the constitutional amendment. You just mentioned it will take a longer time. Yeah. So maybe I hope I will be very happy if you could, we could have some your personal projection on how long it will take. What do you mean by a longer time? So our next speaker will be Jonathan Pollack from USA, the director of Center for China Studies, the Brookings Institution.
Of the new leaders, one of them is not so new. One of them is in his second term in office. That's, of course, President Obama. The question as we look at America's future is, do we see President Obama more able to fulfill many of the goals that he laid out in a first term, some of which he made progress on, some of which he did not? I would certainly say and attest to the fact that he is older and perhaps somewhat wiser. He has had to deal inevitably as president with the frustrations, the unanticipated events, the disappointments, the adjustments that any president, particularly one who necessarily, quite literally, looked very, very different from any of those who preceded him, but to these realities. So I think anyone would accept the fact that there's a great deal of on-the-job training that goes with being president of the United States. It's an unparalleled position. And President Obama, of course, had no prior executive experience before becoming president, but he has had to deal with these realities in the exercise of power and in the conduct of policy. It's been compounded, of course, and if you'll forgive me to make a few historical references before moving ahead, by obviously the extraordinary recession, the economic crisis in the United States, unparalleled since the Great Depression, and from which the United States continues to recover, albeit somewhat slowly. It is compounded further by what can only be described as a toxic political atmosphere in Washington, D.C. That is not befitting, frankly, of a major power. Now, President Obama, from very early on in his term, made clear that he sought an exit from the two debilitating long-term conflicts that the United States had been involved in the greater Middle East, while at the same time insisting that he would continue to protect American national security interests. At the same time, and we'll talk about this, he has endeavored to redirect American attention and energies to the Asia-Pacific region, but where I think in many respects the characterizations and the labels for this policy have vastly exceeded what could realistically expect to be achieved. If there's been a single and singular unanticipated event for President Obama, it of course has been the Arab Spring. It has been jarring. It was not expected or predicted, and it is one that he continues to try to cope with today. So at the end of his first term, I think we can say that President Obama, although was not devoid of accomplishments, but his larger agenda, one of which would redirect the United States, lead to a revival of American purpose, a more technologically innovative economy, and so forth, remains partly achieved but partly not realized, and not even fully spelled out. He had indicated, and he did succeed in the withdrawal of the remaining U.S. forces from Iraq. He increased American deployments into Afghanistan, although he has now pledged that all remaining combat forces will be withdrawn from Afghanistan by 2014. He faces the very unresolved questions related to North Korea's overt nuclear weapons development and Iran's prospective nuclear weapons development. And now he confronts major pressures from various forces for a third U.S. military intervention in the greater Middle East, specifically involving Syria. And this is something that I think it's fair to say the president hopes somehow to avoid, if he can. The question as I look ahead is whether or not, if he feels the pressures on him are such that he has no alternative but to become involved yet again in another conflict in the Middle East, will this take away any kind of an opportunity he might have for a larger international transformation that would yet again be frustrated and deferred? And I'll come back to this. The president clearly is aware that his time is limited. It is the nature of the American electoral cycle that barely have the final results been determined in the presidential election. People are automatically speculating on who comes next. That's unavoidable. That's the nature of the American process, although I think we ought to be able to exhibit more restraint about that, but that's what it is. So he is aware that he has a limited window. What does he do with the time that he has? I think it's fair to say that he still sees his fundamental objective to be America's comprehensive economic recovery. This, of course, is not unlinked to the larger international issues, and we can come back to that. But this has been something that has stymied him very, very much. Obviously, it's not for a president alone to determine these realities. That has got to be his fundamental consideration. He wants to cope with all the drama related to American debt and with what some see as America's fiscal obsessions. And he wants to, as much as he can, try to control the policy agenda that would be set for the coming years. Of course, he faces the congressional election in 2014. I will defer to those who are experts on this. My understanding generally is that the likelihood of the Democrats regaining control of the House of Representatives, though not inconceivable, is highly unlikely for a whole host of reasons that are often too tedious for us to mention. Now, at the same time, he has begun, I think, to remind people of the agenda that he laid out in the first term and to try to see if he can realize it. The president gave a very notable speech just several days ago at the National Defense University in Washington, where he talked about his keen desire to move the United States off what he referred to as its perpetual war footing. This all, of course, all grew out of 9/11, which was a singularly jarring event to the United States and to the world as a whole. The challenge is whether or not he can, in fact, move away from that and move into a different reality. This is where, by the way, I find this term pivot so unbelievably unsatisfactory. A pivot implies something that you can do quickly and unequivocally. And if there's one thing we cannot do, is to pivot away from the greater Middle East. It is a wrenching, long-term, and incomplete process. And I think that the president knows that. At the same time, the experiences since 9/11 have altered the character of America's armed forces. They have altered the bureaucratic politics in Washington, which will long outlive the Obama presidency. It's embedded, even if to some extent, in the psychology that many Americans feel about their circumstances. Now, I know here in China, there are widespread suspicions and criticisms of this so-called rebalancing policy as the presumed centerpiece of American foreign policy. In one respect, I think the administration deserves credit that he was acknowledging a fundamental reality. The center of strategic gravity, economic and strategic gravity, is shifting inexorably to what we will call the Asia-Pacific region. I am wary of this label Asia. That's kind of a mythical creature to me because Asia is large, populated, diverse, but necessarily he has tried to take actions, most notably I think in Southeast Asia, that have in some measurable sense shifted American attention as much as is possible. But the question is, if there is no easy escape from the extraordinary upheavals in the Islamic world, does this deflect or make impossible for the president to make the kind of true shift to this region that I think, frankly, over time, it clearly warrants? This will require, among other things, a move away from the impulse to reach for the trigger first, the highly militarized conceptions of American interests, which I think, though it necessarily, the role of military power is critical, but the larger transitions that are underway within this region, although they involve national security, they go obviously well beyond it. He's also has to, and forgive me for a little bureaucratic reference here, but he has to try to move the American intelligence process back towards its original functions. The Central Intelligence Agency now plays a major role in drone targeting and other kinds of things, and the presumption would be that this is naturally a function that the Department of Defense should assume, not the CIA. We see under Secretary of State Kerry, interestingly enough, an effort to reassert the prerogatives of the State Department. Secretary Kerry has been traveling an extraordinary amount early in his tenure, even as his full team of advisors and so forth are not in place in the department. But he is clearly intent on something we will call diplomacy. He will do this, I think, in a much more measured way than Secretary of State Clinton. And he clearly seems intent, along with Secretary of Defense Hagel, from controlling the tendency to think in terms of adversarially driven international strategies. But President Obama's larger goal persists. It's one of a bigger American renewal that is achievable in terms of technical innovation, renewal of American infrastructure, leadership in all kinds of respects, moves toward more energy autonomy. This, of course, many of these things are going to happen independent of what a president does, but how the president defines this, it seems to me, is critical. But what is the shape of this larger international order to which he seems to aspire? How much time and energy and resources can he devote to this relative to his very, very daunting domestic circumstances that compete for his time and attention? Now, in all of this, of course, I do think, although I don't want to singularize the U.S.-China relationship, it is central to this process. In less than 2 weeks, President Obama and President Xi Jinping will meet in a somewhat remote location in the California desert. This has been arranged, I think, through diligent efforts by both governments over the past few weeks, a recognition that the stakes are simply too big in this relationship for the two presidents, to defer a face-to-face meeting until multilateral diplomacy in Russia in September. This is something that, frankly, a number of us have advocated in recent months, and I'm very heartened that this has, in fact, been realized. where's Jan? Oh, there he is. Yes, we had breakfast this morning, and we were making some comparisons to when President Reagan met with Gorbachev at Reykjavik many years ago, and there are interesting parallels here that we might want to ponder. Yes, but what do they do? Clearly, there have been a lot of ups and downs, both publicly expressed, privately expressed in this relationship over the last few years. I don't think often that it has been nearly as bad as many have liked to assume, but then since those who study strategy have an inherent bias toward pessimism and problems, if you could not identify them, then what would you have to study? But that said, I think that they do reflect some of the real difficulties that are necessarily there in terms, as Bob Zellick talked about last night, the fact that you do have a rapidly ascending or reascending power, as well as an established power that is trying to regain its footing, if you will, in the international system. So I'm not going to specifically advise either president and what they might do when they meet in several weeks. It's just don't miss the opportunity. We don't want to look back a few years from now and say that, yet again, we missed that chance to try first at a personal, dare I say, a psychological level, that the two presidents would try to recognize concerns that they have in common, articulate their differences in honest fashion, and deal with them away from the usual press and pressures that impinge on all leaders. So, what are the things that they ought to avoid? We ought to avoid the kind of an open-ended military competition, if that is possible. We should try to set limits on areas where there is potential antagonism. We should try, and I do mean we, let me emphasize that, because it cannot be done by one or the other, it has to be done by both. We need to see whether it is indeed feasible to talk about a shared strategic space for both countries that respects their respective vital interests, as well as the vital interests of all other states in the Asia-Pacific region. We need rules of the road for economic competition that is fair, for cybersecurity that is realistic, and for intelligently talking about the respective capabilities and directions of both of our militaries in the years to come, as well as our willingness to deal with the potential for true regional crisis, most particularly on the Korean Peninsula. So the goal, if you will, is for an inclusive rule-based international order, and who can object to that, but translating that into practical realities is the much bigger challenge. Is there time, and is there will and political determination on both sides to achieve it in President Obama's remaining time in office? And what happens if both leaderships fail to achieve that kind of a breakthrough and retreat into narrower, self-protective concepts of international politics that then will define their relationship? There is much to be done, so I would only conclude to ask that although President Obama hopes for better, will he leave office in another 3.5 years, finding his larger goals as closer to fruition on a shared international basis? I'm not going to venture a guess on that, but that is clearly what he, and I hope President Xi, will be thinking about over the next several weeks. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan, for your very wide ranges, coverage on new undertakings facing new Obama's administration. You specified some common opportunity in East Asian countries, and at the same time, you observed that some true shift of the, access to pivot to Asia might be difficult, while implying some possible more intensive involvement of Obama administration in the Syrian case, even though you personally expressed your own observation on U.S. The military intervention in the Syrian case. So maybe I hope we could have more discuss on that issues. My last my speakers on my list will be Dr. Kim Young-ho, who is working as a professor in the University of Korea. Actually, Professor Song Ho-gun was expected to present today's presentation on the Korean side, but unfortunately, he made some inadvertent mistake, in checking his visa problem. So he was rejected, in the airport. So that's why now I ask, Professor Kim to make some quick fix, presentation on behalf of him. Now let's welcome Professor Kim. Okay, thank you.
It is my great honor to be here this morning, even though I'm a substitute for Professor Song, who is supposed to present his paper here today. Do you know spare tire? I feel I'm a spare tire replacing flat tire. Anyway, I'm trying to be a good spare tire. I'm going to follow Professor Song's PPT file one by one. His presentation is consisted of 4 parts. First, major characteristics of new leadership in South Korea, North Korea, China, and Japan. Secondly, basic principles for peace and prosperity in East Asia. Third, current issues of this region, including Japanese leaders' political maneuvering or manipulation of history. Finally, immediate agenda for regional cooperation in East Asia. Let me talk about Mr. Song's observation, Professor Song's observation on major characteristics of new leadership in East Asia. Chinese President Xi Jinping is basically a leader of pragmatism. In this regard, he is quite similar to United States President Barack Obama. Next, South Korean President Park Geun-hye is a leader of moderate right, emphasizing trust between political leaders and her or his mass public, trust between South and North Korea, and trust between South Korea and foreign countries. The third one is Japanese Prime Minister Abe Shinzo. He is a leader of radical right, spearheading strong Japan. Lastly, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un appears to be rampant and militant. Professor Song Ho-gun is worrying about the fact that the chemistry of these 4 leaders is not harmonious, but appears rather conflictual. Let me move on to the major issues now in East Asia. He believes that East Asian countries must tackle the following 3 challenges for peace and prosperity in this region. First, North Korea's military intimidation, including the country's nuclear threat and the conventional military provocations. Second, Japan's radicalization toward ultra-right. Lastly, very limited leverage for China and South Korea to solve the 2 serious challenges I mentioned, Japan and North Korea have persistently put over the past decades. If the current situation does not improve in the near future, he believed that East Asia would face major political crisis sooner or later. Let's move to Professor Song's Korean perspective regarding these issues. He says that South Koreans feel that the country is currently squeezed between North Korean leaders' military intimidation on the one hand and the Japanese leaders' political manipulation of history. Let me show you some examples in South Korean news media Professor Song prepared. Japanese Prime Minister said definition of invasion is uncertain, which means that Japanese invasion of Korea may not be really invasion. He also said that comfort woman was inevitable for strong truth and hardship. On the other hand, North Korean authorities said that North Korea is ready to wage war if the United States do not stop its anti-North Korean campaign. Professor Song believes that Professor Song is discussing about how do we solve the current problems of East Asia. He said that political leaders of East Asian countries must create a consensus on at least the following three fundamental principles for peace and prosperity in this region. First, do not use or manipulate the history for begging political support at the domestic level. Second, do not reverse the assault and victims of the Japanese colonial period. Lastly, do not distort the history and educate history as it is for the people of East Asian countries. He believed that more than a majority of the people in South Korea, China, and Japan would support these principles, even though he has strong doubt on North Korea on the question of whether the country would respect these principles. Let me move to Professor Song's discussion of how to effectively induce substantial change in North Korea. He said it's not easy, it's not simple. However, we must try to change North Korean government policy, North Korean regime, North Korean people, and North Korean leaders. He said that the basic directions of our policy toward North Korea. We cannot give up the peaceful coexistence of the two Koreas and the denuclearization of North Korea. We must follow the two-track approach. Maximum deterrence on the one hand and multilateral dialogue on the other hand for effectively inducing change in North Korea from the country's military-first policy, 선군 정치 in Korean, to a kind of economic-first policy, 선경 정치. Now let me move to the question of how to deal with Japan's radicalization. He said that we need to find some solution for Japan's radicalization, moving toward ultra-right. He said that we need to get some definite answers to the following questions. For our discussion, he suggested the following 3 questions. What are the main reasons of the Japanese leaders to strengthen the military forces? Second, is the historical view of Prime Minister Abe Shinzo common to Japanese people? Is Prime Minister Abe's historical view a common sense in Japanese society? Finally, what are the gains and the losses of Japanese people when Japanese leaders say that they are not assaults but victims of Japanese colonial period? Let me move to the question of what do we need to do right now for peace and prosperity in East Asia. He suggested the following 3 potential items we need to do for peace and prosperity in this region. First, economic cooperation by creating a free trade zone in the region in the near future. Second, searching for common tasks for social development, particularly welfare and the labor market. In other words, East Asian countries, South Korea, China, and Japan altogether need to develop a new model of welfare and labor economy for the peace and prosperity of the individual country as well as the region as a whole. I think he is trying to say that we need an alternative to neoliberalism or Washington consensus. Finally, we need to improve collective wisdom for co-prosperity of East Asia. Let me skip this part because it's very hard to understand this figure and the next one. Finally, he suggested his final recommendation for peace and the prosperity of East Asia. We need to activate and upgrade our exchange programs of East Asian countries. He said that there are 3 fields of exchange programs, including politicians, journalists, and academic scholars of East Asian countries. Let me just add my own recommendations to Professor Song's suggestion of upgrading exchange programs of East Asian countries. I hope an epistemic community of East Asia will be created in the near future, as European Union have done over the past decades. Epistemic community means transnational intellectual networks which are constituted of politicians, bureaucrats, journalists, academic scholars, and other specialists who are able to identify and share new issues and agendas, as well as collectively find and implement some solutions for the challenges they face for peace and prosperity of East Asia. I hope this forum would be a stepping stone for consolidating epistemic community in East Asia. Thank you.
I'd like to pay attention to your last comment on the possible way to create some starting point on the road to the regional integration. Even though which model we should follow. But anyway, it's good start. For us to have some brainstorming on future integration of this region. Now, I'd like to invite 2 discussants, Professor Woo-Shin-bo and also Professor Yeom-jae-ho. I will give you 3 minutes, each of you, respectively.
Not a 5?
Oh, I'm sorry, 5. Yes, 5 minutes. Yeah. Wu Xinbo is, he is convener of this meeting. Now working as executive dean, Institute of International Studies, Fudan University. Okay, floor is yours. Okay.
Thank you. Like you all, I also enjoyed very much the presentation by the 5 distinguished speakers. Given the limit of time, so I will go very quickly to each of the speakers and raise my questions or make some very brief comments. For President Yang Jiemin, he has the authority to talk about the foreign policy of the new leadership. I think I can sit to talk here. Okay. Well, the question for President Yang is having talked about the conceptual innovation of the new leadership. To what extent this kind of new concepts have been transformed into the policy practice? For example, in your observation, what would be the new priorities of the foreign policy of the new leadership, and also what are the possible new approaches, new instruments for foreign policy, given China's growing capability, material and otherwise? So that's my question for President Yang. For Dr. Kutunov, I'm thinking about how to understand Putin's foreign policy when he came back as the president. It's already 20 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but from the outside, sometimes we feel that Russia is still a kind of uncertain power, uncertain about its position in the world, and uncertain about its relations with the rest of the world, and uncertain about its comparative advantage that it should utilize in pursuing the foreign and security policy agenda. If we think about the approaches in the last several years, there was a hope for a kind of a resetting of relations with Washington, but that didn't materialize. There was some hope that Russia could be even reintegrated into Europe. But now Europe is basically still in a crisis. So that may not be that attractive to Moscow. And will Russia pay more attention to relations to countries in East Asia, especially with China? If that is the case, as you mentioned, what kind of creative thinking and policy instruments should the Putin government employ to pursue that goal? For Mr. Tanaka, I think the biggest challenge is, if we talk about Abe's foreign policy, is how much longer he will stay in power? 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. So I think that is a big question for leaders in the world when they think about engaging with Japanese leaders. They hope that this leader will not step down after they just meet. So that also have to do with the political capital that some country leaders they should spend in improving relations with Japan. And the second question is, that is a puzzle for me. What's the mainstream opinion in Japan about the world, and what does the world look like to the Japanese? Do you really have a mainstream worldview? And also about Japan's position in this international political structure. Sometimes it's difficult to get this kind of impression because I haven't seen much intellectual debate in Japan about this kind of conceptual issues. While the Chinese, they like to talk about this kind of big and conceptual issues. And the next question related to this is, to what extent Abe will handle relations with China in a more realistic way? Because currently it seems like he's traveling around China, reach out to every of China's neighbor, maybe including North Korea. That's not value diplomacy. This is anti-China diplomacy. But I don't think this will work, whether you call it value or whatever you call. Maybe he just want to, consolidate his position before reaching out to China, or he really believes that he can create this kind of anti-China coalition, maybe single-handedly without support of the United States. So a lot of puzzles about Abe's foreign policy. For Jonathan Pollock, well, my question is very simple. What will Obama's second-term China policy look like? Will there be some adjustments on the basis of the first term after this kind of expectation, illusion, disillusion, frustration? So are there any serious thinking about how to make the China policy both pragmatic and also feasible in his second term? And to what extent the forthcoming summit between President Obama and President Xi represent a serious effort by the Obama administration to have a kind of reset of relations with China after this kind of pivotal to Asia rebalance to Asia, which, in my opinion, does have a strong component of checking and counterbalance China in this region. Last, for not for Professor Song, but actually for Professor Kim, I think your recommendation is very interesting. If we look at East Asia, in both Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia, we have seen a very interesting phenomenon. That is, the small or medium countries or the regional blocs, they acted as a kind of bridge, facilitator for regional cooperation. ASEAN played this kind of role for East Asian for 10 plus X cooperation. And ROK also initiated some trilateral projects among China, Japan, and ROK. So to that extent, I think ROK is still quite idealistic, but also optimistic about the future of this region. Now, with the previous administrations, one favored the reconciliation with the North, the other favored returning to the alliance with the United States. With this current administration, President Park's administration, we think really about a kind of resetting Korea's position as a kind of a bridge and facilitator for regional cooperation in East Asia, which will go beyond either North or the U.S. alliance system. So that's my question. Thank you.
Now I'd like to introduce my next discussant, Professor Yeom-jae Ho, who is professor of the Department of Public Administration of Korea University. Now he's acting as a senior vice president of Korea University. I'd like welcome.
Just inviting me. And, oh, sorry. I'm confused. Yeah, Fudan University to invite me to participate in this very important, very interesting session. I'm very much privileged to just make a comment on each distinguished professors and the scholars' speech, but Professor Wu already just give some question to each of the presenters. So I like to very briefly just give some comments to all the participants. The first thing is that it is in relation to the new leadership in the East Asian region. For example, you know that last year and this year, there are new leaders in China, Japan, and North Korea and South Korea. But common factor is, interestingly enough, all of those leaders are second generation or third generation. I mean that their father or grandfather was a leader of the China, Japan, and North Korea and South Korea. it has two different meanings. One is that they just continue the sort of institutional legacy or something like that. That is a common just interpretation. But another one is that if I just examine the new leaders, the second generation, third generation, not only in the nation but also in, for example, industry or the farms, they try to make some kind of change and very innovative or surpass their father or grandfather. So it is a little bit just a tricky and also just a little bit dangerous issue. Today, I just borrowed just Graham Allison's Essence of Decisions book. The one is he interpreted the Cuban Missile Crisis decision-making process 3 different models. The one is rational, the other one is organizational, and the third one is bureaucratic politics model. But I got an impression that all of the presenters, a little bit exception is that Professor Kim's presentation, or 4 of them are a little bit rational approach or something like a very idealistic. So I'd like to play the role of devil's advocate. I'd like to interpret this situation very pessimistic way. And what is your opinion? And not the idealistic, the foreign policy, but the realistic foreign policy issue. I got an impression that it is some kind of symptoms arise in every country. For example, in Japan and in Korea and China, public sentiments are quite different that you described as foreign policy in China, Japan, and Korea. There are a lot of conflicts, and in the cyberspace, they criticize very seriously. And as you know, last year, I was told that 15,000 Toyota cars were crashed down in China. So it is some kind of paradigmatic change. Sudden break of equilibrium may be possible, or it may be some kind of collapse of plateau just before the big earthquake. So how do you think about this kind of problem? For example, very simple interpretation, I may be wrong, but I'm a little bit specialist in Japan. So for Japanese history, it may be very much a simplified one, but for example, Meiji Restoration, after Meiji Restoration, Japan has accumulated a lot of national capital, but they waste all their money because of the Sino-Japan War and Russia-Japan War. They wasted up. And then they just constructed their country, and after the Taisho democracy, they accumulated a lot of capital, but wasted up because of the Pacific War and the invasion of Manchuria and the Korean Peninsula. So the last 3 decades, Japan has experienced some kind of lost generation. I mean that something like the economy, the sort of until the 1990s, early 1990s, after the 1985 Plaza the agreement, and their economy was stagnated and during the 20 or 30 years. And in between, you know that after the LDP's just the establishment and the Yoshida's foreign policy model, under the US security umbrella, there's no role of Japan, even though their economic power is very strong. There's no role in international politics. So there are national complaints just has risen. For example, the famous Ishihara Shintaro's book, Noto Ieru Nihon, Japan, which can say no. And they have to speak out some word in the international politics. It is accumulated. So it is quite interesting. The Japanese economy achieved the superpower and then stagnated, and because of the domestic problems, they tried to make some kind of role in the international politics. But quite interestingly enough, China has focused on the economic development, only the economic issues. But very recently, I mean that since several years ago, they are very, very aggressive in developing natural resources. They played a significant role in Southeast Asia and Africa and even in Latin America. So Professor Wu mentioned that peace-oriented power, that is some kind of slogan, but in reality, from Japanese side, they watched China, it is a superpower in international politics. So Japan needs to play some kind of role in the international politics. So they speak out and they become more, in a sense, very aggressive and in a way, very inserting the neighbor countries and neighboring people, reject history or something like that. So it is a kind of a reality. So how do you interpret this kind of, just before the collapse of plateau or the big earthquake, probably within a decade or so, some kind of a new political order will arise in the Northeast Asian region. So I think that in this reason, United States should play the role to mitigate this kind of tension. And Professor Wu mentioned that South Korea may play the role of some kind of a mitigator. But anyway, the territorial disputes between China and Japan and Hashimoto's speech and also the Abe's position, all these kind of things are some kind of symptoms to speak out in the international politics, especially the neighborhood countries. So yesterday, Professor Tanaka just raised an issue. This kind of Shanghai Forum and this kind of intellectual community is very, very necessary to speak together and just suggest an idea instead of the popularization of the political leaders in Japan or some other countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Young. So maybe I'd like to keep 2 minutes each of our presenters to make some response. The President Yang, you first.
I wrote a paper on 10 aspects of conceptual innovation of the new Chinese leadership, but I decided to talk about only one. That's a new type of major power relations. I think this reflects the new leadership's desire on the negative or passive side and positive and productive side. On the negative and avoiding part, the new leadership wants to work transcending the old pattern of the inevitable clashes between the rising power and the established power. And our commentator just now mentioned China's so-called assertiveness, and because China is rising and militarily, economically stronger, so Japan would single out China as a kind of concern or even more. But if you look at China's attitudes toward the United States is militarily much stronger, but China has not mentioned at all that in order to cope with the pivoting, rebalancing of the United States, so we need to write in black and white in our national security strategy to against United States. So you can compare the two mentalities and attitudes. That is to say, China really wants to avoid it. In Xi Jinping's word, it's unprecedented, but it can be something enlightening to the successors, to the generations to come. On the productive and proactive side, that is to say, Mr. Xi Jinping wants very much to talk with President Obama at the Annenberg Estate on how we could do it. And China's new type of major power relations is both philosophical and target-oriented, as well as issue or troubleshooting. But the U.S. new model of rising and established powers is more on the issues. And the United States talked about military relations, economic independence, and cybersecurity issues, plus North Korea issue, Iranian issue, so on and so forth. I think they can find the overlapping of their mutual interests and concerns to work that. And as my good friend Janice said to me at breakfast, and we must put some fresh meat on the bone. That is to say, we have to beef up the concept of new type of major power relations. Thank you.
I think that the peculiar feature of modern times is that each political leader has to deal with two agendas at the same time. We still have the old 20th century agenda when we talk about arms race, about territorial disputes, about non-proliferation, about divided nations. This is unfinished business. This is something that we have to do in order to move ahead. At the same time, there is a new agenda. The new agenda which is related to social interaction, to NGOs, to cyber, to issues like food security, resources, and so on. And I think that if you take, for example, Putin, for evident reasons, he feels that the old agenda is something that he is more comfortable with. And therefore, we see these United Nations resolutions and veto because Russia, to some extent like China, sticks to the traditional pattern of international law. Because the assumption is that any change in international law might be detrimental to Russian interests, and someone should be the guardian of the current international system, including the United Nations. Therefore, the United Nations reform is not going ahead. And I think that in order really to be successful, the Russian foreign policy, like any foreign policy, should be more sensitive to the new dimensions of international relations. It should be more sensitive to social and the cultural dimensions of the relationship. And let me just give one example, and I will finish here. If you take the relations between Russia and China, during the glorious days of the Soviet-Chinese Union, we used to call this relationship as brotherly in Moscow. But we didn't realize that in the Chinese language, the word brother really does not exist, because it is either elder brother or junior brother, and there is nothing offending, but this is a specifics of the cultural approach. And if we assume that today China becomes the elder brother, that means that cultural sensitivity to the country and the social interaction should take a much more important place than it has right now in the bilateral relations. Thank you.
A couple of things. I do not categorize Japanese Prime Minister Abe as ultra-right politician. He may have a conservative nationalistic viewpoint as an individual, but as a Prime Minister, he is bound to be realistic. Point number one. Point number two, in relation to the question of the history, again, he will have to follow the sort of general public sentiment in relation to the question of the past. which Japanese people has. And I think majority of the Japanese people would like to uphold the Murayama statement. So as an eventuality, I think Japan will uphold the very basic thought which is contained in Murayama statement. We have created a huge damage on the neighboring nations. So the third question of the conceptual thinking on the part of Japan, I think what is most important for the national interest of Japan is how to make sure that we live in East Asia in a peaceful and prosperous way. And the key question we are to debate is a question of how to cope with a rising China in a constructive way. You put yourself in the Japanese, you see all of a sudden a very rapidly rising China. And China has about 2.5% of GDP spent for military. Japan only spent 0.9% on its military. The huge nation arising in the neighborhood of Japan. Japan has a legitimate concern. And as from 2010, it appears China has become much more aggressive out of the creation of their confidence, possibly. But yet, I do believe that China would have to learn from the responses on the part of very many nations. And you talked about what type of policies do we have vis-à-vis China. We would like to have an inclusive policy with China, but yet we would have to safeguard our future national security as well. The international relations is made of reciprocal treatment, reciprocal. And I'm sure the Japanese Prime Minister would like to sit down with the Chinese president and to talk about much broader issues of how to cope with future East Asia. The question of Senkaku. I think what is important for us all is to neutralize the issue so that we could talk about important future relationship between Japan and China. So I hope that Prime Minister Abe is going to be much more realistic. I'll stop here.
If I could, I'm going to redefine the question that Wu Xinbo asked. I think that to talk about the second-term priorities in U.S.-China policy is far too limited a concept. The question is not what the United States advocates in terms of a policy. The question is whether or not both countries, both leaderships, can define meaningfully a larger relationship. In other words, an awareness that it is not simply a question of what we do, what China does, but rather understanding how those worlds intersect. This is not only a question in terms of, if you will, grand strategy, but on a host of issues. Because either we find a way ahead on issues ranging from cybersecurity to our respective military strategies, to climate change and a host of other factors, or we proceed more or less as states have generally tended to do with the predictable kinds of results that eventuate. I think we ought to be able to do better. Now, the question here, though, and Yang Jianmian reminds us in our breakfast conversation, talking about taking the concept that China has articulated and understanding it better. Many Chinese ask me what I think of this concept. And I say, I don't know, because I don't know what it is. It's a slogan. It's a bumper sticker. It may have a great deal of meaning, but in order to determine what meaning it has, we have to almost think of it, say, okay, if that's what we're seeking, for example, something specific, something that just does not, to be frank, I think that sometimes what Americans often find frustrating in interactions with China is precisely these labels and concepts that may sound good in their words, but which we have a very difficult time understanding in practice. I think this goes well beyond the US-China relationship, and the goal ought to be, on the one hand, for President Obama to reaffirm that his commitment to American involvement in Asia is real, is tangible, not to be diminished. The United States wants to be present and accounted for in all the critical dimensions of national power. This is not an issue alone in terms of the relationship with China, although I think that the relationship with China, as you point out, is central to that. But I do think our political conceptions are lagging behind the realities that are transforming global and regional politics, and both countries ought to be able to do better. On the issue that Professor Yum has raised, I'm not often called an idealist, or I hope not too rational, although maybe we all ought to try that on for size and see where it doesn't work. It seems to me, though, that we really have entered a world, and I think you're absolutely correct to identify this, where the forces that are impinging on leaders are coming from multiple levels. They don't have the latitude, the scrutiny under which their policies are evaluated from every vantage point is real. At the same time, I'm less concerned about what kind of an understanding that would come out between President Obama and President Xi in several weeks' time. No doubt there will be some kind of a statement at the end. The question is not what they say, but what happens in the aftermath of what they do, and that is to obligate the crucial policy bureaucracies of both countries to courses of action that are sustainable. Obviously here, questions of if you find, for example, the national security bureaucracies of both countries, even though they are not equivalent in their structures and so forth, but if they pursue courses of action that push us more toward a more, if not adversarial, what I'll call quasi-adversarial posture, we'll both get what we deserve. So that's the test of leaders. Can they not only articulate a better concept, but can they obligate their respective systems to achieve it? And for that, we have to wait and see. Thank you.
I would like to reply to Professor Wu's question very briefly. We are trying to play a role of bridge country or middle power between superpower and developing countries in Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia. Unfortunately, my country is very much preoccupied with North Korea's nuclear and military threat. I sincerely hope that China, under Xi Jinping's leadership, would play more active and more constructive role in changing North Korea's military first policy than before. Thank you.
Now it's on time, 11:10. But as I promised you, I'd like to invite just one or two questions, even we are just behind the schedule. You're the first. Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting discussion. My name is Teppo Turkki. I'm coming from Finland, from the Finnish Innovation Fund. Such a simple question. As a European, it's very, I feel a little bit distance today, and I would like to hear from maybe all the panelists. Do you see any role that the European Union can play in the East Asian region? Or how do you see the European role in the new opportunities? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And next, yes.
I'm from China. I have a question for Mr. Tanaka, and another question for Mr. Pelak. I believe it is not always necessary by Mr. Tanaka to borrow tithes from Americans. Could you tell me whether if the Abe economics is the long retreat way, it's just a long retreat way for Banach Skewy? Are you sure the Japanese people agree with that? If not, another world war? Thank you.
Is it comment or question? Question, okay.
Yeah. Okay. What do you think of that?
Okay. Some other
Another question for Mr. Pollack.
Mr. Pollack. Yeah.
Oh, Pollack. Jonathan Pollack, yeah. Could you explain for us that ask for China is a big responsibility country? It's just because China is a socialism, and the USA is a big unresponsibility country, or just a responsibility for itself. It's because the American is capitalism, or FED is a private institute. Thank you.
Okay. So, yes.
A question about the new type major power relationship. So for Yang Tianmian or Jonathan Pollack, to put meat on the bones, I'm wondering, given the commitment of the Xi Jinping administration to undertake deeper economic reforms in the coming year, do you think at the summit in June it would be possible to begin on building this new type relationship by announcing that the US and China would work towards China talking about joining the TPP negotiations?
Okay. Okay, the last question might be.
Nikita Lomagin from Russia, St. Petersburg. I have a question to both Andrei Kortunov and Hitoshi Tanaka. So we both spoke about the heritage we inherited from 20th century, and one of them is territorial dispute between Russia and Japan. For many reasons, it's obvious that Russia is very much interested in a solution of this disputes. What are parameters of a potential solution, taking into account that both leaders are rather strong, they both are capable to make compromises, and domestic political settings are much better than in previous decades? Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
To the question of Europeans' role, yes, European has a demonstrative role for regional cooperation and integration. Europe has the economic role for being the largest world economy if EU combined, and Europeans have the normative role because Europe is good at making and selling the institutions, norms, rules, but these are the potential or not the fully tapped ones. It's depending on Europe's political will and integrated power to translate this potentiality into reality. As to China's attitudes toward the TPP or TTIP, I think China's position is open, and I'm pretty sure that President Obama and President Hu Jintao will touch upon this. Xi Jinping, sorry, we'll talk about it. Yeah, okay, thank you.
Okay, Jonathan.
Let me agree, actually, very much with what Yang Jianmian said about the European role. I mean, it would seem to me of a lot of the questions that are posed about China are the extent to which China can be fully integrated into larger institutional arrangements and the like. Europe has a wealth of experience here, and where, frankly, it would seem to me that that experience is distinctive enough in its own right that I, for one, would not advocate, in some sense, if you will, tethering European thinking to whatever the American strategy might be. I mean, it's a different possibility. It opens conceptually and otherwise other possibilities and is really worth pursuing. On my Chinese colleague's question, I have increasing difficulty recognizing China as a socialist system. It's a state capitalist system. I understand what China says. I understand what the labels are. You're in a transitional stage of socialism, but this is where I think the label just does not describe the reality. And if we can begin from that, even though it may be difficult for China's leaders to acknowledge that it's such, because you don't want to undermine the role of the Communist Party and so forth, that's understandable. But I think we need to begin with a real recognition of just how much the economy of this country has been transformed and needs to transform further as it tries to advance in the years to come. Avery Goldstein raises a provocative question. I will openly acknowledge, Avery, I have great difficulty figuring out if you axiomatically exclude the world's second largest economy from this presumed rules-based system that you were trying to achieve, it looks a little suspect at the outset. I mean, I would say, for example, the fact that Vietnam is a candidate for inclusion in the TPP. I am sure Vietnam labors under some of the same liabilities that China does, maybe not on the same scale because it's not as big as China, but there ought to be a much more open discussion. If the United States has issues or concerns here that it feels what states ought to be doing to open their economies and fulfill their responsibilities, at a minimum, this ought to be something that the two presidents talk about when they meet in 2 weeks. Whether the TPP will get where it seeks to go, on that I still have my doubts, but we'll see, I suppose.
First question to do with Europe. We are very interested in the fate of Europe, European Union, and I'm sure Europe is interested in the future of East Asia. And then Europe must find a legitimate role in playing in relation to East Asia, because the future of East Asia must be a strong concern on the part of European Union. So don't ask us, you will find yourself. Second question of Chinese colleagues, war. I don't believe there is going to be a war, because we stand to lose a lot by not just war, but a small conflict as well. But yet, it is very important for us to learn from each other. There is a need for better understanding about what Chinese think and what Japanese think. Japan has a shortcoming, no question about it, but you have a shortcoming as well. So let's make use of this type of forum, Shanghai forum, or any other intellectual exchanges. That is very needed in the future. Question of Russia, I think there is, I mean, when I negotiated North Korea for the Japanese Prime Minister's trip to Pyongyang, I all the time talked about big picture, because without a big picture, we were not able to resolve things like abductees. The question of territories with Russia, I think we need to put things in a much broader picture. What interest we have in the betterment of the relationship between Japan and Russia has what interest you have in East Asia. Then I think there is a way for us to accommodate the claims on the part of Japan and on the part of Russia. Thank you.
Mr. Cortuno?
Since I am the only European on the panel, I just want to make my 5-cent contribution to the discussion. You probably know that just a couple of weeks ago, it was announced that Samsung has overtaken Nokia as the single biggest producer of mobile phones. Well, they did it with smartphones, but right now it is accumulated. And I think that I had to switch from Nokia to Samsung myself because the software is more advanced. But I think this is something that we Europeans should keep in mind. The only way to stay relevant to East Asia is to invest much more in innovation. Europe is lagging behind North America and East Asia in innovation, IT, in new technologies. And this is, I think, the major challenge for Europeans to prove that Europe is a leader in human capital. That's not easy, but this is something that has to be done. Now, in terms of the Russian-Japanese relations, it's a big issue, but I think there are essentially two ways to approach it. One way is purely technical, and when I talk to my Japanese colleagues right now, they say, okay, the arrangement is likely to be something more than 2 islets, something less than 4, something in between, maybe, territorial parity, something like that. I think that it is doable, but I think it is not very likely, exactly because it doesn't contain a broader picture. I think that we should reach such an arrangement with Japan that this issue will be not as important or as visible as it is right now. And then psychologically, politically, it would be much more, it would be much easier to resolve the issue, keep in mind this broader picture of East Asia integration. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, during the first North Korean nuclear crisis, the international community created an international consortium under the name of KEDO, K-E-D-O, Korean Energy Development Plan project. At that time, EU participated as regular members. There Korea, Japan, United States, and EU as regular members. So it's clear, the evidence of such, the active participation. And on top of that, EU will work as some role model or some kind of great lessons on the way to any possible regional integration of Northeast Asia. Yeah. So anyway, I thank you for your 3 times. It's not torturing, but 3 times intervention, very unusual case. So thank you for your arduous, the contribution and also your active participation. Before I join this meeting, here we have some. We are with Mr. Bob Jelik, who gave some the keynote speech yesterday. I wonder if you have any comment. Okay.
He's been silenced for the first time.
As a courtesy to the keynote speeches. Thank you so much. Again, let's finish our great work with applaud. Okay. Thank you.